of Hadar is one of the exclusive and iconic spells of the Warlock class. It can do many useful things for you with just one cast, depending on your playstyle and the goal you try to achieve. This guide aims to explore various uses of Hunger of Hadar that can prove useful if you happen to run a Warlock in your playthrough. First, a brief overview of the spell for those who might be unfamiliar with it. Typically, only Warlocks can learn Hunger of Hadar at level 5, with the exception of Bards, who can also acquire this spell through magical secrets at level 10, or as early as level 6 for College of Lore Bard subclass. There is also a staff in Act 3 that allows caster to use Hunger of Hadar once per short rest as a 5th level spell, thanks to one of its many elemental enhancements. However, I don't recommend doing so, as you'd be squandering a late-game weapon for 2 low-level spells, one of which doesn't gain any additional effects when upcasted to higher levels. In combat, this spell acts as an area denial that drastically slows down and blinds any creatures caught within it, essentially shutting down all means of offensive capabilities for the affected targets. It's also an enabler that boosts your party's hit chance against trapped enemies. And finally, a hazard zone that does continuous area damage over time, the longer they remain inside. So right off the bat, that's a lot of goodies for one spell, and we're going to make the most of every single one. In Honor mode, there's a special rule where using any harmful actions to start a fight will cause you to lose that action once combat begins.
I will take the artifact for my queen!
Although Hunger of Hadar is considered a hostile spell, it doesn't inflict damage immediately, but only when a creature starts or ends its turn within the area. As a result, the first strike rule in Honor mode doesn't apply to this spell. This effectively lets you use Hunger of Hadar to initiate a battle, while still retaining your action at the start of combat. So you can just go straight to swinging or blasting, without having to set up the spell mid-fight. Since Hunger of Hadar only damages targets that start and end their turns within its area, melee characters can move in, make their attacks, and retreat without suffering any negative effects from the spell, provided they have enough move speed or buffs that negate difficult terrain penalty, whether from spells, equipments, or class features.
Have to keep going.
Another way melee characters can use Hunger of Hadar is to set up advantage for their attacks. Normally, both you and your enemies are blinded inside the sphere, which would leave your attacks at a standard hit chance, with neither advantage nor disadvantage. To work around this, you can position the sphere so that only its edge overlaps with enemies, allowing you to remain outside and attack without being affected by the blindness. Alternatively, you can use equipment that grants blindness immunity, provided they complement your current build. This tactic is particularly useful to ensure advantage on all melee attacks, without relying on or competing for equipment that grants advantage, especially in early game, when there aren't that many options to increase hit chances against high AC enemies.
Wait!
Keep in mind that Devil's Sight does not give the Warlock immunity to blindness, only the ability to see through magical darkness. It won't negate the blindness caused by Hunger of Hadar, contrary to what one might expect. Playing as a ranged character is much more straightforward, as they can just comfortably hang back and rain down attacks on enemies for the advantage bonus without any extra steps. However, adding in a couple of area hazards or crowd controls can turn Hunger of Hadar into a complete death trap for your enemies. You could mix in additional damage hazards to inflict more continuous damage each turn, or put down even more extreme difficult terrains to slow enemy move speed to a snail's pace, or punishing surfaces that ensnare and knock targets off their feet every time they attempt to move. If you have multiple warlocks in your party, deploying more than one Hunger of Hadar is also a viable strategy to stack additional damage procs from the spell and create an even larger, deadlier choke point. Although this approach may not be the best fit for a party with strong focus on melee builds, in such case, it's better to focus on crowd control effects to keep the surface clear and approachable for your frontliners, so they can safely move in to make their attacks as well. Any hard crowd control effects that can incapacitate or stun enemies for several turns are highly effective, whether it comes from spells, attacks, or abilities.
In that corpse.
Likewise, many soft crowd control effects that knock enemies prone, ensnare, or pin them in place can also work wonders. These effects hinder enemy movement, and when enemies can't move or see to make their attacks, they will be forced to skip their turns entirely.
Regard this spontaneous flatulator.
Prone targets must use 50% of their movement in order to stand up. As a result, they could only take a few steps before ending their turns. Additionally, you can get creative by using abilities that forcibly move enemies to push them back inside the sphere. Frightened targets cannot move, and in addition to being blinded from Hunger of Hadar, they can do very little even when the exit is just a few steps away. There are limited ways to increase the spell's damage. This is due to the fact that damage caused by Hunger of Hadar is considered as environmental damage rather than spell damage, a complete separate entity from the caster. Since most gear effects rely on the caster being the source of damage, which isn't the case here, so most universal damage boosters won't work, even though they usually apply to almost everything else. However, there are a few exceptions, such as Falar Aluve and Wet Condition. Essentially, any damage boost that comes from debuff effects is effective, because it directly increases damage enemies receive. Falar Aluve adds 1d4 thunder damage to each tick of cold and acid damage, as long as they remain within the aura. Simply positioning your character at the outer edge of Hunger of Hadar will do the trick.
No holding back.
Keep in mind that cold damage is guaranteed to trigger, while acid damage at the end requires a saving throw before it can deal damage to the target. This is why acid damage appears less common. There are several ways to apply the Wet Condition, such as using Create Water spell, Water Bottles, or Water Myrmidon summon. each with multiple different approaches to them. However, to maximize action economy, I'll only focus on a couple of the more efficient methods. This method takes a similar approach to the very first tip in this video, where you can cast Create Water spell on enemies before engaging in combat or enter it mid-fight. Since water itself is harmless, no action will be consumed after initiating combat this way, effectively bypassing the first strike rule. The second method involves using a Quasit summon, or a particularly cheeky one,
Nice to meet you, dickhead.
who can turn invisible at will outside of combat. During battle, you can drop a water bottle near your desired targets, then have the still invisible Quasit smash it, applying wet to nearby enemies without costing your party any actions. Doing so allows you to apply the condition whenever you choose, rather than waiting for the summon's turn in combat, which is often delayed due to their low initiative.
No holding back.
Naturally, if your party has any lightning or ice attacks in their arsenal, feel free to use them and take advantage of the wet condition. As for how to obtain a Quasit without being a fiend warlock, you first need to acquire its scroll from the apothecary's cellar in Blighted Village. Normally, you'd have to follow a specific set of dialogue and interactions in order to learn the spell here. However, by traveling to an entirely different map, such as the Shadowlands or Mountain Pass, will cause the Quasit to have an alternate dialogue. It no longer mentions the basement or the Book of Necromancy. Instead, it simply appears happy to tag along with you permanently.
Oh, shit, Billy, rag. Huh? Who are you? Oh, nice to meet you, dickhead. Last nipple meat slab called me shovel. Don't like it? Change it. Basket, I like. So you're Basket's master now. Fine, call me when the fisting starts.
And that's a wrap for this video. I hope these insights on Hunger of Hadar prove useful in your playthroughs and give you new ways to experiment with your warlock builds, no matter what builds you choose to adapt them into.